there's so much pollution in the air now that if it weren't for our lungs, there'd be no place to put it all. Robert Orden. Because I strongly agree with his theory and his ideas, I have to put forward this notion that developed nations have a higher obligation to combat climate change. The main reasonings behind this are the following 3 points. Number 1, developed nations are the ones that primarily cause this. Number 2, they must in fact set the standard for them being those developed nations. And number 3, most importantly, we must protect those developing nations to not put them under a higher obligation. The first and one of the most important things about this resolution is that we need to make sure that they're fixing what they have caused. In fact, developed countries cause global warming, so they must fix it. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Jiang Yu stated that it must be pointed out that climate change has been caused by the long-term historic emissions of developed countries and their high per capita emissions. Developed countries bear an unshakable responsibility. Most importantly, we're needing to make sure that these developed countries are having these higher obligations because they have in fact put out that carbon emission per capita because of that trying to become developed and trying to get to the places they are now. Another reason behind that is it's hypocritical for developed countries to complain at developing countries for polluting more heavily at the present, when this is exactly what developed countries did long ago to retrieve their great wealth. The main important thing is that we're not needing to focus on these developing nations doing this because the developed nations have in fact in the past gone forth and has emitted such a great carbon emissions towards the skies. And another reason, like I mentioned, we must in fact those developed nations must in fact set the standards because developed nations, developed states emit more, their steps have a higher impact. The UN report criticized Washington for not imposing nationwide mandatory cuts on industrial emissions, stating that the fact that the world's richest countries are also the biggest carbon emitters. If we realize that the biggest and more prominent countries out there are in fact the ones that are supplying and giving off more pollution, then we realize that they in fact must set the standards because they are such a great and productive nation. We realize that they are capable to get people's attention and to have people listen to them. And in that same aspect, the United States in and of itself is responsible to lead in fighting for global warming because it is essential, because the rest of the world looks to the U.S. for leadership, and the rest of the world looks to those developed nations for leaderships because they have in fact produced so well in the past, and they are in fact in such a great existence today. Another reason why they have to set forth this because developing states will not go green before developed competitors. Right now, China and India, which are developed, are very concerned with their development and their capacity to compete with the developed world. With significantly greater poverty and instability, they have far less flexibility to tamper with their competitiveness with developed nations on the global economic stage. They won't go green unless the developed world goes green first. And that aspect, we need to make sure that we set the standard and we make sure that the developed nations are in fact having that obligation to combat climate change, or else no one else will. And thirdly, we must protect those developing nations because this is not only our world, but it is those developing nations as well. And we need to not only set that standard, but we need to make sure that we are protecting all nations involved.
Developed nations do not have a higher obligation to combat climate change. And we can see this by looking at 3 main points. 1, that all countries are equal in obligation. 2, developing countries need to change more, so they're going to end up doing more. And that even if developed countries change, the developing countries are still going to be there. Now, let's expand on our first point, that all countries are equal in their obligation. All countries live in this world. All people live in all of these countries, and all of us are human beings. We also all use fossil fuels in some way, fashion, or form. We all pollute in some way. Not a single one of us is more important than any other. Clearly we can see that since we all made the mess, we all have to clean it up. If you spill some milk, you aren't going to put the burden on somebody else to clean it up for you. You have to do it yourself. The same applies to our environment, and we clearly see that all countries must be equal in their part or nothing's going to get done. Our second point is that developing countries need to change more. We can see clearly that as the world is rapidly transforming and industrializing, concerns about the effects of climate change have become increasingly prominent in the minds of leaders and citizens across the globe. Both developed and developing nations must now work together and propose the implementation of green technology. In developing countries, this has become more important than ever. More developing countries are demanding green technology to help sustain their growing population and consumption of goods. Examples of green technology subject areas include, but are not limited to, energy, green building, green chemistry, green nanotechnology. All of these essential to create a green world that doesn't pollute and reduces climate change. And all of it is going to come from an equal part on all nations. Energy includes energy efficiency, developing of renewable fuels, and most important issue for green technology. All the others will simply follow suit. Our third and final point is that developed countries may change, but the developing countries are still going to be there. Developed countries create more pollution right now. But some of the developing countries, such as China and many other of the heavily populated, highly population density countries, are going to begin developing at some point in time. When they do, they're going currently to develop with fossil fuels. These fossil fuels are going to cause even more pollution than before, overshadowing any effect that developed countries might take. Unless we have these developing countries come in as well, nothing is actually going to happen. Once again, all countries are equal. The climate change actually affects the developing countries more. Governments in developing countries are demanding a greater focus on and funding for adaptation to green, with countries such as Bangladesh and China leading the way. There is, however, no clear path to successful adaptation. What are the best strategies? Who will pay? Above all, who should benefit the most? The poorest countries and the poorest people within them have contributed to at least greenhouse gas emissions, but often face the greatest future risks from climate change. Pro-poor adaptation must ensure that they benefit the most from adaptation. So in conclusion, we can see that all countries are equal in their obligation because all countries have polluted in the same way. All of the developing countries need the change, so they're going to help out too, because it's impossible for them to get it without. And our final point is that developed may change, but developing need the change, and they're still going to be there even if they don't. Thank you.
Alright, we're going to start out by trying to actually counter what my opponent just stated. In fact, we can see that her three areas were actually, first, all countries have the same obligation. This would be true if all countries had actually started with the same amount of emissions. China and the United States are the leading world in emission release into the air right now. So obviously the US is one of the higher obligations. Also, my opponent seems to have ignored the fact that in my partner's last speech, we can see that we actually stated that China would go along if other people were doing it. So clearly what's actually going to happen here is that China would follow suit, and that completely goes against the third area of analysis. These developing countries will only go if someone else does it first, which means that the higher countries obviously have the higher obligation because we're seeing that after they're already developed, they're the only ones that can afford this. In fact, we can look to a country such as continents such as South America and Africa, where people are starving. They live in shacks. Do you really expect people are wanting more than just a cup of food to live through the night, and they want green energy instead when they can't even get electricity at their house? I highly doubt this. That's why the actual developing countries have to move first. That just because they have a higher obligation, it says they have a higher obligation to combat it. It doesn't mean they just have to actually move it in their own country, but they can also move ahead in other countries as well. That means they can actually help these developing countries by supporting green energy inside of them to become developed countries, helping them and the global combat at once. And so we can see how that actually goes with this. Also, on the second area, we can see that her argument over developing countries want this is completely false because developing countries want to become developed. They don't want to try and move in and try and start completely over again with a new type of energy. So what they're actually going to do here is hope that they can see what works best. And that's why the United States and the other developed countries have the highest obligation. They can set the example saying that this is it works great and we can ensure to you that it actually works. And if they can actually do this, then we're going to see that the countries will be able to go through and make